Welcome to the Weekend Sports Cars on the Marshall Pruitt Podcast, presented to you by Cooper Tires and the Justice Brothers and my sports car brother, Graham Goodwin, calling in from the United Kingdom. How is life in the land of dailysportscar.com?
It's great, Marshall. It's nice to be home after a week in the south of France. Not the worst place to be, of course, just the beginning of spring, but the weather was not very kind to us through most of the week, although beautiful for race weekend for the Michelin Le Mans Cup and then the season opener on Sunday of the European Le Mans Series. But back here in daylight, the British summertime, now adjusted on our clocks and looking forward to another 90 minutes of Twisk loveliness.
Well, you were there in good old France for some sporty car action. I was in Long Beach, where IMSA held its third round of the season for the WeatherTech Sports Car Championship. As the official chooser of categories each week on Twist, the Weekend Sports Cars, I ask you, fine sir, where we should start among the categories that we have created for the awesome questions that have been sent in via social media from our somewhat crazy, kooky listener base.
I'm going to mix it up. Because I think there's a section of our listenership that don't get enough of our attention. And I think what we should do is maybe 10 minutes at the start with some of our general and fun questions. Then we're going to move on to a bit of a sprint format, as is perfectly appropriate for IMSA after the Long Beach weekend, and then a bit of WEC AsLMS ACO, and then finish off with some more of our general. How about that?
Wow, we're bouncing all over, like my personality, far from linear. All right, well, let's get the ball rolling then in general and fun. And shall I pose the first question to you, my friend, or how shall we kick? All righty.
Go for it.
We're going to go to our pal Kiwi Chris 1709, who says, we had all these fantastic series to watch last weekend, as well as many other series you don't mention above, but we couldn't watch Super GT. Why? Reading the daily sports car articles, I got confused. Are we blaming JAF? Let's Go Racing, this Malaysian company who owns the rights, apparently? Help! So, Japan's #1 sports car series. Any insights as to why that was not readily available for Kiwi Chris to possibly consume?
Absolutely. And we've also got not dissimilar questions from good chaps, Hubcap Motors, Paul Morgan, Andrew Pike asking a slightly wider question about geo-blocking. It looks to me to be a bit of a hot mess. And I think, to be honest with you, the JAF have actually just completely misunderstood the scope and scale of the international audience. There's no doubt whatsoever that two or three factors have come together to grow that community that is now a regular follower of the Super GT Championship. It's one of these unicorn things, isn't it? We'd all have loved to have followed had there ever been the opportunity to do so. Kudos to that point to Nismo for stepping up and funding the English language coverage we've enjoyed over the last 2 or 3 years, initially with Radio Show Limited and latterly with their own production with Grand Central Productions, Sam Collins and latterly Rob Barth in the chair. And that has been a hugely successful plus. You've then got the guys doing the written word and stand-up. RJ O'Connell, contributor to Daily Sports Car on his own Super GT World website, and others, for basically unlocking the secrets of Super GT to an international audience, and that's brought big numbers as well. The third factor, of course, is the fact that we've got, as we've always had, international drivers taking part in Super GT. But, you know, with absolute respect to the likes of James Rossiter and, for that matter, Jan Mardenborough, there's no doubt that actually the arrival last season of Jenson Button, an ex-Formula One world champion, no less, massively increased the level of interest in the championship. And Jensen himself actually helped to fund, in fact did fund, highlights package in English language using my broadcasting colleague Toby Moody as the kind of front man for that. all of that came together. That audience is building nicely, and somewhere along the line, someone has dropped the ball here. It partly to do with Nismo pulling out their backing, partly to do, I think, with the fact that it just was not seen as a priority. The answer to the question, having spoken to a couple of people directly involved in this shenanigans, is there is work underway to get a solution in place. And it seems that the majority of the people involved in those discussions are confident that a solution can and will be found. We can but hope, because I think that would be a massive miss for those concerned. It is certainly fair to say that in some regards, Super GT has been pretty inward looking. In a way, sort of, that DTM has been, but not in terms of the broadcast side. It is effectively a national championship with the potential or the actuality of being having an international appeal. I think Super GT have had a bit of a wake-up call in answer to a couple of people's questions, has the kind of polite feedback to say, hang on a minute, guys, don't forget us, had an impact. I genuinely think it has. I genuinely think that the fact that that fans in their droves have gone taken to social media to feedback, guys, we love your show. Please don't forget our part of it. I think that has had an impact. Will it have an impact on the commercial side of things? I don't yet know. But I think I'd like to say, as someone who does value that championship, thank you for those that actually took up the challenge from RJ and from myself and from others to feedback politely and positively. I think that's had an impact. And let's wait and see in the coming days and weeks to see whether or not something can come out the other side.
Let's go to, and I can never pronounce this, BHTOOEFR. I want you to actually give me your thought on how that should be pronounced, Graham, because I'm at a loss.
Booty fur.
Booty fur?
Yeah, booty fur.
Okay.
I'm just doing it on the basis of the what was written on the side of my coffee cup at Starbucks in Avignon. That might well be a kind of French pronunciation that seems to, oddly enough, he's put in some vowels, but I presume it's he, that they seem to take out the vowels and put the letters of my name in a strange way, but somehow Grum, Ghrm, sort of works, but Bootifer.
We still need an explanation. Please write in and tell us how you came up with that. It's pretty awesome. Here's one that's interesting. I might be able to flag this up quickly. We've had yet another sports car race this weekend where rain and a succession of red flags ruined it. There have been questions before about this. I believe the nature of the tires involved has been brought up in the past, but it's been pointed out that the aerodynamic concepts in modern sports cars are part of the problem too. Nowadays, even GT cars are designed around significant amounts of underbody downforce and therefore have to be low to the ground. This has also compromised the design of some cars, the Porsche 911 having to go to a mid-engine to make room for a diffuser being the most infamous example. Is it time to rethink modern GT aero and use regulations to ensure sufficient ground clearance to handle standing water safely? I'll admit that this isn't necessarily appropriate for prototypes, but there are plenty of sports car series that are all GT after all. Interesting point. I would just say that re-engineering an entire style of sports car racing to handle the somewhat infrequent arrival of rain, truly rained out series. I think that might be a stretch. I think that might be trying to solve something that happens on a limited basis and redoing everything to account for something that doesn't happen all that often. And I'm just speaking in very general terms. That to me would seem to be a very bizarre way to approach things. Now, granted, if we're talking about a particular domestic GT championship that happens to be, it's just raining all the time, I would say that would be a perfect idea to consider. But if we're talking about just a general approach to GT racing being altered in the off chance that rain is the thing that marks the entire event, we get 1 or 2, maybe 3 at most rain races per year if I'm thinking Graham and IMSA. And out of the 10, 11, 12 times the cars are on track, I'm just trying to think of the majority here. Also, outside of just ride height to accommodate for rain, we know that the lower a car can be, the lower its center of gravity, the better it is going to perform. So it's not just a case of the car being low for the sake of maximizing underbody aerodynamics. Every car, every GT, touring car, you name it, I have worked on, owned, entered, etc., most had minimal, if almost just zero underbody downforce. That does not and did not impact the fact that my efforts to get that sucker as low as I could to actually improve its cornering capabilities, that's just standard practice. So I think the answer here is might be something worth considering if we're talking about the Malaysian GT series and it's just in a constant tropical rain shower or similar, but worldwide, I can't see how any manufacturer would sign off on fundamentally altering the handling of their cars to accommodate for the somewhat infrequent rain race that might limit their ability to run as hard as they want due to lowered ride height, etc. So that one, get the idea, just not sure it's a starter. Where should we go next, sir?
Let's have a quick look a bit further down. It's a quick Kiwi quiz, Frank. It's an easy one to answer. It asks on GT racing, specifically a couple of things. So Monza Blancpain Endurance started its season over the weekend, another one with very mixed conditions. Where is the McLaren? Surprised no one's running it in the Blancpain Endurance Series. Is there an issue beyond the service here, just time constraints? The answer is pretty simple. McLaren, I believe, had a potential customer for the Blancpain Endurance Series, but that just did not come off. The McLaren is, of course, running elsewhere. We've seen the announcement last week that Mika Hakkinen will be joining the grid for the Suzuka 10 Hours. So that should make 3 McLarens in the Suzuka 10 Hours, in addition to Kazumichi Go's 2 new cars. We've got 3 McLarens in the International GT Open, Europe's other major all GT series. We've got one that will be gracing the grid of the British GT Championship that gets underway for the first time this season, this weekend at Oulton Park. We've had one that's already won a race in Australia, and we've got one in Blancpain Asia. I think I said, was it last week, MP, that I was at the factory just last week, actually the week before last, apologies.
Yeah.
And cars 9 to 11 were in build, 9 almost completed, and with certainly 12 ordered. And my guess is that will not stop there. There comes a point, when you can't deliver cars for competition for a season where you'll start to see things tail off. But I think they're in pretty good shape. Is Blancpain a gap? It most certainly is. They can be very well aware of that. I'm sure the guys are working hard to find a solution for it. But there's certainly no problem on that front with the competitiveness of the car or indeed of the order book. Whether or not they can actually find a solution to getting a car on the grid for Blancpain, well, I think we'll probably know later this year. Over to you.
Over to me. Oh, you're so polite. I mean, of the many attributes we love about you. Let's see. As usual, we have so many awesome things here to choose from. Let's see. We'll go to Bucksock, who says, Marshall, you seem to dislike people talking about a, quote, front splitter and things similar to that. I can understand what you mean with your arguments, but isn't it easier to understand for new fans this way when they're talking about a certain part of the car and maybe the fans are inclined to look it up afterwards?
Yeah, you exclusionist. Yeah.
No,
Boo.
I know. Maybe. I just figure if you speak about something accurately and correctly from the outset, then people will know what they're looking for. There's no,
Marshall, sorry.
Yes.
No, you've got to go and sit down quietly and think about what you've done. Think about them. Yeah. Think of the children.
I know.
It's actually fairness. It's a fair point. And it's a fair point. I'd like a bit of feedback, actually, here, because there's another question a little later on, before you get into this, about whether or not anybody would value a bit of a 101 on some of the weirdness that is sports car racing. I have considered sitting down and writing something. There's a question a little later here, which I'll answer right now, which is what is the difference between NFI Blancpain GT3 and a VLN SP9, for instance? And it is one of those nuances, isn't it? Well, now, actually, this year, there is a difference. The difference is they're 5% less power in the SP9, but it's exactly the same car otherwise. But it's a fair question. How do you build the audience if the rule book is as complex as it actually is, and the technology and the technical side of things are as complex as they actually are? And without the resource that sits behind the mammoth that is something like Formula One, where we're just battered by technical jargon for something like F1, it's a fair point.
Yeah, I try not to be super pedantic guy, but this is just something that continually frustrates me, and it's just me, not saying it's anyone else. It's like my love of the expression, me personally. You just go, well, you covered that with me. There's no need for a personally, or vice versa. You could say personally, I don't like it. You don't need to say me personally. It's a pure redundancy. The same thing here. I'm just explaining this, so I'm not saying I'm right or wrong, although I obviously think I'm right. There's no need to say front splitter. There's only one splitter. It happens to be at the front of the car. So if you're describing parts on the car, do you say the front windshield? No, there's one windshield. It's at the front of the car. There's no need to say front windshield. The front wiper blades. No, the wiper blades are at the front of the car. There's no need, again, so this to me falls along the same lines. So if we're talking about educating someone about things that are unique to a vehicle, I would just say that accurately describing them without some sort of silly redundancy, it's actually maybe the best way, so folks get it correctly the first time. We get this in open wheel racing a lot, where folks describe the front nose. And that, I mean, I always just either laugh or pound my head against the table and say, really? Do we need to tell someone there's a front nose? Most people can discern the fact that they've never seen a rear nose on any living creature, on anything, much less a racing vehicle. So do we need to say...
You're looking at the wrong specialist websites, that's all I can say.
Well, fair point. I better, the dark web might have those things for me. So I get your point. I'm one of those people who says, why not give folks the accurate thing up front so they know what it is? There's no rear splitter. There's no front rear bumper. There is, now if you have two of something, that's great. Front bumper, rear bumper. But there's no need to call out things that are truly unique in their position. So, again, that's just my mindset. We don't call out the front windshield because we know there's only one windshield. Why call out front splitter when there's only one splitter? It's that simple mindset.
Fair enough.
Moving on.
By the way, it was Jonathan Grabowski that asked the question about the SP9 versus GT3. Thank you for that one, Jonathan. But let's move on from accuracy to accurate, and let's move on to IMSA. We've had our 10 minutes.
Look at that little... That's a
smoother than whipped cream.
A beautiful Segui, also a segue, I think.
I'm going to just serve these up like some kind of frenetic Roger Federer robot.
Well, hold on. Did we officially move to IMSA? Did you say that?
Did.
Because if you, well, you said we're going to Acura, but did you say we're moving to IMSA? There might be a penalty involved here. There might be a fine. There's a BOP.
We're edging into pedantry here. What, the balance of pedantry? Right, IMSA, letter, and break. IMSA. Tom Bacon asks you, Marshall Pruitt.
Me?
After struggling at Sebring, what was the catalyst for Acura Team Penske's resurgence at Long Beach?
Well, I just mentioned the three most hated letters on this show. We could say that balance of performance was certainly something that seemed to be recognized as maybe not being totally in their favor, leaving Sebring, and so at least in conversation, other than looking at the BOP tables myself, at least in conversation with folks from other non-Acura ARX05 teams, Tom, they seem to think that those cars should have converted pole position into a fairly easy 1-2 victory. Yeah, and there's also a post-Long Beach fear that without a BOP change going into the next round at Mid-Ohio in a couple of weeks, that we are going to see those cars absolutely walk away from everybody else. So that's not diminishing the hard work put in by Acura Team Penske, but the BOP baton of favor gets passed around from team to team throughout the year. From manufacturer to manufacturer throughout the year. So there are some events where we say, boy, Mazda should own this. The Nissan should absolutely walk the field. Cadillac, etc., etc. Long Beach definitely looked like it should have been Acura's victory. And Mid-Ohio, where they won their first race in the series last year, could be a repeat without a BOP adjustment based on a fair amount of feedback from their competitors.
Cynicism alert. Acura favoured in Acura-sponsored event. Shock. Moving on. Kevin Payne asks, do you foresee IMSA expanding its reach overseas, apart from the Mans entries, or would they leave the international series to the likes of SRO and the FIA WEC? Absolutely not, Kevin.
And I apologize, I picked up a little something at Long Beach that I'm trying to get out of my throat, but it won't. I don't see that happening at all, Kev. I really don't. Knowing how every team that I can think of in IMSA, even the manufacturer entries, speak about budgets and really being stretched as far as they're comfortable in going. Adding an international component, I think that would just be super prohibitive. The only caveat is when those things happen, on most occasions, there's some sort of agreement between the series and the promoter of that international event. Travel for the vehicles will get covered, sometimes for the teams, so there's a minimization of the costs to the teams attending those international events. So that might ease that part to some degree. Would also say that where there's another significant challenge here that is a concern, barring allowance of IMSA's cars or entire series taking part at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, pretty much anywhere else they might go, there's just going to be more or less no marketing value. Granted, if it was a race in Japan, possibly, Mazda, Acura, and Nissan through the core team might be rather excited. But again, just as a whole, for team spending, for teams with sponsors, we hear that a lot in other series. We hear IndyCar teams say, hey, the last international event they had was in Brazil. And while there were some Brazilian drivers, and they're very popular and so on, you had a lot of teams who said, hey, I can't sell that race. My sponsors don't have a real footprint in Brazil, and so therefore they don't really want to, looking at the annual budget, they've said, hey, that one's up to you to find with someone else. And I can just remember hearing from many teams saying, hey, do you know anybody? You know anybody wanting to spend like $50,000 to be on the car, which is a drop in the bucket, just because there was no real interest in funding that. So between cost to the teams, Kev, and also the potential minimal, if not just complete absence of value to sponsors, I just can't foresee IMSA trying to go beyond its United States and Canadian footprint.
I'm going to move to a question from Mike Stoops. Now, Mike asked the question I'm going to slightly alter here. Why do the IMSA GTD cars not race at the Grand Prix Long Beach? Is it cost? Is there no room? It would help the show if they were there, especially for next year if the GTLM field gets smaller. And let's go on to say that. What do you think, Marshall? If the GTLM field does get smaller, should there be a rethink?
Absolutely. I believe there were 19 cars on the entry list. And while that number seemed nice and compact, I believe that's in the general minimum number zone that Long Beach tends to want for a championship to compete. think I might have mentioned this a year ago or so on an episode of Inside, good Lord, the Weekend Sports Cars, where I believe it was 2009, maybe? The 2009 ALMS race at Long Beach. Don Panos had to come out of pocket to put a couple of extra Esperante GT2s into the field, because without them, they would have actually dipped below the minimum number necessary in their contract with the Grand Prix Association. That was right after the big financial collapse in 2008. But definitely that number 18, I believe, is the minimum number I've heard. I don't know if it's still accurate today, but back to your point, Mike, yeah, I would say if that there is a reduction in GTLM numbers next year, it would certainly be something for them to consider. Granted, could you boost and get over that 18 threshold, get into the 20-ish or so, or low 20s, by adding in LMP2? Again, we'll have to see. There's only 2 full-time cars right now. But could that be a way to do it in place of GTLM? Possibly. The reason that they stripped Long Beach was just trying to bring down costs for GTD. It has certainly become vastly expensive, far more than anyone anticipated. So trying to limit a long haul for many teams across the country to the West Coast, that would be 2 trips, knowing that we will be coming back here in September for the Monterey round. That was, I think, a very smart move on IMSA's part to try and curb costs and such. Also, there's definitely some mayhem at the hands of some Pro-Am drivers in GTD in the past at Long Beach. We'll also say, Graham, that, pretty fun to see last weekend, where it was all pro, DPI, and GTLM, the best of the best. And they still found walls, and they still spun, and they still did all kinds of things. So whatever theory that if you strip away the Pro-Am, the non-pros, boy, the racing's going to get better and there'll be less mayhem. There wasn't as much mayhem as we've seen in the past, but there was still a surprising number of mistakes. So, yeah, I guess that argument, Mike, of, well, we don't want this to be a yellow fest or red flags and such. It wasn't, there was some merit to that, but, again, even some of the best displayed a little bit of iffiness throughout the weekend. But it'll be interesting to see if and what they come up with if we do have this cut down in GTLM numbers overall.
We got 3 questions I can band together here, really. They're not quite the same, but there's a sort of common theme throughout them. Lance Snyder asks about LMP2, if it doesn't pick up in the next couple of years, what looks to be a new DPI formula in 2022. Might the series allow the Gen 1 DPIs to run as a class in IMSA competition? Simtech 1 asks, how can the LMP2 DPI split and the seeming failure of the LMP2 class in IMSA be fixed? Could a halfway measure, such as limiting DPI development in something and removing some spec regs for LMP2 while running IMSA, fix it? Would the IMSA be allowed to do that? And Irish Tiger 89 says, with the limited number of OEMs willing to sell their DPIs, the struggles that Peter has seen this year, why hasn't IMSA worked with Orica and Gibson, for instance, to develop an upgrade kit that would allow the Orica 07 to be competitive in the DPI class?
Interesting. I guess if we look at...
How about the Gen 1 DPI question first?
Yeah. I mean, to me, there's possibly something there. What I'm not totally sure about is whether we would be in a position where there's a need for IMSA to either make use of the first-gen DPIs and have those as something that could become, the equivalent of LMP2, what we have now. We do expect the new DPIs to be faster, meaner, better, and whatnot than first-gen cars. So I think just performance separation would be a natural thing. Could that be an interesting way for some teams to recoup some money by being able to sell their used first-gen DPIs? Yeah, I like that. I absolutely like that idea. What I don't know, and what we won't know until we get a better feel, Graham, for if and where this LMP2 class is or is not headed, is there a reason to keep the thing afloat going into 2020? Obviously, you've got the PR1 Matheson team that has invested. You also have Brent O'Neill and the Performance Tech team that has invested. You've got a couple of entrants who have spent the money and, have decided to go all in. It's just 2 full-time cars, though. Is there a reasonable expectation there will be more coming next year in the years beyond to keep that open? There's the other aspect, too, of obviously at the big races, at Daytona and Sebring in particular, maybe a little bit at Petit Le Mans if there isn't a clash with the WEC or ELMS. Could there be some international friends that come over to play with their P2s? If those things seem reasonable, then I would see a value in keeping the LMP2 formula moving forward. But if IMSA just does not get the feeling that there is such a thing, yeah, I like the idea of, in a couple of years, when the Gen 2 DPIs arrive, I do like the idea of hopefully passing on the first gen cars and that effectively replacing LMP2 if it's just not going anywhere. I also like the idea that's been floated about, hey, could IMSA work with the 2 brands that have the most the most representation? I know you mentioned Oreca and Gibson, also throw in Ligier, knowing that while there aren't any running an LMP2 now, I know that PR1 Matheson still has theirs, which could be rolled out. Those 2 are by far the most common ones, but the thought of IMSA working with Oreca and Ligier and Gibson to, bring those cars up to competitive speeds with DPIs, I think that's brilliant. I really do. The whole balance of performance thing, this is just a weird thing, Graham. And we've spoken about this a number of times before, so I don't want to get back into the full conversation. But IMSA saw the possibility for P2 to take off. They received a fair amount of input from teams that, we're going to come in, we're going to do something. A lot of those plans changed after IMSA announced they were going to separate DPI and P2. Now we're at this awkward place where there's 2 P2s trailing around the country, kind of having their own fight, really between themselves. We have not seen the LMP2s really part of any of the major fights going on up front. We've obviously also seen that there's been some, performance separation between DPI and P2, but they've just been non-factors altogether. We haven't really seen, Graham, the one thing we've hoped for is the PR1 Matheson team and Performance Tech just having a knockdown, drag-out fight, wheel to wheel. Granted, we're talking a 24-hour race and a 12-hour race, so those might not be perfect windows for that, but we're certainly hoping that as we get to some of the shorter races that those 2 entrants are able to at least have a good fight among themselves. Because if they can't, if they don't, if one car is braking, the other one's crashing, and it's kind of one team more or less locked in for the win, the people paying to be in those cars might be happy to get a trophy, but that's not going to sustain their interest for very long. So there's some real questions here that IMSA is going to need to answer. And the biggest one, which I don't have an exact answer to, is since P2, or whatever we want to call the class below the all-pro DPIs, is meant to be a place where teams and drivers develop themselves before they hopefully step up and can buy a DPI and fight for the overall win. If that's not working, if that thing's broken, and it's kind of broken right now, that concerns me. When you don't have a meaningful class where pro-ams, up-and-coming, not quite ready for primetime teams and drivers can learn and develop and get ready, if that's gone, I know that IMSA has their LMP3 class, but that still doesn't seem like exactly the right place to get ready for real hardcore WeatherTech championship competitions. So there's some big questions here, brother, other than just how are they going to get more cars.
Absolutely. Let's run through a couple of questions around events that actually happened on track at the Long Beach Grand Prix last weekend. Alex O'Bara, Sean Caldwell, and Walter Ritchie all asked questions around various drivers hitting the pit limiter button coming out of the hairpin. Alex says with the problems the then leading Ford GT had coming out the hairpin is the location of the pit limiter button, something that's mandated by IMSA, FIA, Sierra, the manufacturer's decision. And Walter and Sean Caldwell also point out that Elio Castroneves hit neutral of the hairpin, gave up 2 positions. So others bumped the pit limiter. Can we talk about the button layout?
Yeah, that was certainly a topic that influenced the outcome of the Bubba Burger Grand Prix. What an interesting name for an event, the Bubba Burger Grand Prix. Very American.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, so the button layout's an interesting thing. There's a couple adjustments I would expect to come out of this event. First of all, there's no mandating of you must have a pit speed limiter button, to my knowledge. It's just one of those practical things you would not want a driver to have to manage on their own, knowing it would be very easy to run afoul of the maximum pit speed and therefore get a penalty. So, yeah, gonna need them, going to want them, etc. What I would expect to come out of the event on the Ford side, on the Acura side, hopefully every single team would look at, is there some sort of cover we can put over the buttons that can either engage pit speed limit or throw it into neutral without our absolute explicit desire to do so, effectively having to flip open a little plastic or similar window that covers it. I guess like in every kind of disaster end of the world movie where the bad guy flips open the thing so he can press the doomsday button kind of thing. That's one thing that comes to mind. The other idea that I had, and I believe this should be capable, but of course nothing's ever 100% bulletproof, Graham, but knowing how GPS-based data and information is such a prevalent thing in motor racing, I would think, in terms of lockouts and such, it might be possible through the use of GPS for the potential to activate, in particular, the pit lane speed limiter. I'm not so much sure about neutral, because that might be needed if you have a spin or otherwise on track, but let's just say only for the pit lane speed limiter, to effectively map out through GPS, hey, unless you are within, 20 feet of pit lane entry and, 100 feet past pit lane exit, or pick whatever the number is, you can press this button all day long and it's not going to do a darn thing. So something that basically eliminates its function, unless you're within a narrow defined band, through GPS on the track where there would be an actual need to activate it. So that might be the kind of big brother Skynet becoming self-aware solution. The other one might just be as simple as placing some sort of protective cover over it that you have to slide up or move and then hit. So knowing that 99% of the time drivers know when they need to hit the pit speed limit button, there should in theory be more than enough time to slide that protective device out of the way in order to do that.
Excellent stuff. A couple of other points. This is around the way in which the racing emerged and also the way in which some of that racing was managed. The brilliantly named, when we're talking about his street race, Mark Urban, says, gentlemen, there was quite a bit of beating and banging at the Long Beach IMSA race, obviously. What are your opinions of what we saw for the drivers in terms of the aggressive nature of the race? Did they go over the top, or is this just part of a rare 100-minute sports car race on a tight street circuit? Hashtag me personally, I loved it. Like vintage NASCAR on a road course, reminded Mark of Robbie Gordon versus Kurt Busch at Watkins Glen in 2006. Separate points, but actually not dramatically unconnected. John Sable says, were the local cautions for cars in the tyres in the race good enough? Always understand the race director's motivation for keeping the race moving, but it really made for some sketchy moments. Yeah,
so to the first question, I would say, Mark, for sure, it is a natural part of an incredibly short race on a street course where, barring a bunch of yellows, a bunch of crashes, as John mentioned, unless there's a lot of stoppages, or pauses, I should say, to create the opportunity for fun, for jumping one another on the restarts, pit strategy options and such, you, for the most part, don't have a lot of time. There's no time for patience in a 100-minute race, and that's actually kind of the fun, I think, of Long Beach. It's, hey, you gotta go like heck. Any of the pleasantries and any of the gentlemanly and gentlewomanly driving that we might see at other races, yeah, it's not happening here. Even Detroit, which is longer, you still have that sense of, nope, this place can be an absolute procession because of the rather narrow walls, or the narrow width of the track, all the reasons that we know can make street racing somewhat not awesome. There just seems to be a greater sense of urgency to go forward, and if that going forward involves bumping and banging, that just seems to be par for the course. Also, in many cases, I would say, Mark, the speed differentials certainly play a factor here, where there are points definitely at Long Beach going to turn 1, going into a couple of corners where drivers are at a high rate of speed. But for the most part, a little bit of Calvin Fish's favorite argy-bargy. It's going to happen second, third gear, fourth gear at most of the corners. Therefore, the real risk of a super high-speed shunt and crazy damage would happen to be lower. The same kind of body rubbing and panel banging going into turn 1 at Road America, for example, it would not be accepted, knowing that both cars would still be in outer space waiting to come back down due to the high rate of speed. So, yeah, it's kind of a perfect collision of circumstances, and yeah, I love it. I think it's great. I mean, what's better than seeing these priceless supercars and prototypes coming back looking like they were in a Saturday night, short oval dirt race in the middle of Kentucky somewhere. So, yeah, I guess I'm a little bit weird, but I do like that just a little bit.
Another quick combination question. This is about the choices of strategy that a couple of the teams made. One from Walter Ritchie, again, who says, do we think we'll see issues this season with the Penske Acuras being too aggressive on tyre wear? He says Ricky Taylor was very close to the 5 Caddy at Long Beach. If he hadn't needed a pair of tyres and only taken one like the Cadillac, could that have given him a win? Jerry Robert Sudduth, meanwhile, talks about the Fords, the Chip Ganassi Fords, daring with their strategy at both Long Beach and Daytona seems not to have panned out either time for them. Is it a testament to the close competition of the class? They're trying to get an advantage they can, any advantage they can, or are they attempting to overcome something with the car?
I think in the case of Ford, we're looking at, how close the class is, but also with 2 entries, the thoughts of splitting strategy certainly would come to mind. If we look at what happened with the highest qualifying Ford, the one driven by our friend Monsieur French Fry Sebastian Bourdais, Seb qualified 4th. They ended up hitting and then having a perfectly timed yellow come out where that thrust them into the lead. The Porsches were just, I would say, too darn fast on their own. Obviously, Dirk Mueller hitting the pit lane speed limiter by mistake helped the winning car driven, or at that point driven by Earl Bamber, to move ahead. But I still think that was going to happen regardless. So, just keep in mind that all the context we just saw, very short race. Clearly, the Porsches were the class of the field. The Fords, I believe, qualified 4th and 8th out of 8 cars or something like that. They were not as sharp as they had hoped. Yeah, you are certainly going to try some strategy-based fun to overcome some of the deficiencies. As for Daytona, I have to raise my hand and admit I'm not really remembering the scenario there you're referring to. So that's not questioning it, just saying I don't remember. So I'll just have to go with what comes to mind for Long Beach.
We'll start to wind down on the IMSA front with a couple of questions away from Long Beach. After this one, Nate Detweiler says, rumours that Los Angeles Angels might build a new stadium on part of the current circuit. What track would you most like to see IMSA visit if Long Beach drops off the schedule?
Boy, where do they not go that I would love to see them visit? Wow, that's actually... This is just a retro one, and it's silly because that's one of my specialties, but having attended the Del Mar Grand Prix in kind of sort of San Diego, so further south in Southern California.
Is that a town name? Kind of somewhere?
Yes. Del Mar, there was a, quote, street race. It was run in and around the Del Mar horse racing fairgrounds. Was a site of some pretty awesome IMSA races back in the 1980s. I think it extended into the very early 90s, maybe 91, 92. But it was a blast. And yeah, the track's maybe a little bit tight compared to today's standards for a street course, but yeah, I mean, that maybe stands out as a, well, if Long Beach were to ever go away, how could we keep the series in the same general area and put on something fun that we've at least seen work in the past? That stands out. I mean, after that, boy, where should IMSA go that it does not go where it's been in the past? I mean, there's obviously a lot of great circuits. We spoke about this last week, which, again, maybe it's another Pacific Northwest thing. If by chance it happened to, if Long Beach did go away, then I would say that should automatically make Portland the default replacement for it, knowing that they are trying to resuscitate Portland International Raceway as a marquee joint that once held GTP races and ALMS races. And at least based on the turnout for the return of IndyCar in September, or I think over Labor Day weekend last year, Graham, there's a lot of folks who were really wanting them to come back, really happy that they did. And, you know, the crowd wasn't gigantic, but it was incredibly promising. Gave me every reason to believe that there's something positive happening. So I'd say Portland, something staying on the West Coast, something that has worked in the past. That would be the one I would go to for sure. And as we said last week, if the crowds continue to be absolutely tiny, as they've been at Monterey, that might become a decision IMSA makes sooner than later, regardless of where Long Beach happens to stand.
I'm going to tell you you're wrong. I think there's a massive miss there, Marshall. It's not like you to miss the opportunity, the commercial opportunity, to go and have a street race in Las Vegas. And I think we should do the Diamonds Are Forever Grand Prix down Fremont Street. You must, at some point, go on two wheels through a very narrow street, emerging at the other end with one of the most famous mistakes in cinema history, emerging on the other end on the opposite wheels that you started down that alleyway, as James Bond most certainly did in that fantastic movie. Wouldn't that be cool, though? Street race in Las Vegas.
Wow. Well, and you've also brought a little bit of Days of Thunder and or Fast and Furious to it. Leave it to you to come up with the great options, Graham Goodwin.
Right, we're going to finish off with IMSA for the moment. We've had a listener with the surname Urban. We're now going to go to one with the surname Metropolis, albeit with a slightly Greek take on the Metropolis side. Michael Metropolis says, now the C8 Corvette is official for 2020 with a July date for the unveiling of the road car. Any clues on what we might start to see around the C8R emerging and when it might test on track, MP?
So if I remember, I believe the date I saw on the side of that was July 18th for the unveil.
I think that's correct. Yeah.
So my thoughts, I think last week on how Le Mans would be the obvious place to discuss such things. Again, that might be a little bit hard since the car's formal debut is coming roughly a month after the 24 hours. So, it's hard for me to suggest exactly when and where because maybe, again, I'm just missing something exceptionally obvious, but the July 18th date does not stand out to me. There must be some sort of, auto show or something show coming that I'm just not aware of what's on the calendar. I mean, if we look at in terms of what IMSA has, we know that July 20th is the Northeast Grand Prix, the GT only, GTLM and GTD WeatherTech Sports Car Championship race at Lime Rock Park in Connecticut. But that too, although we love it and it's amazing, that seems like it'd be a weird place to do anything there. So I'm at a bit of a loss as to the when, where, and how. I do hope that in addition to the road car being confirmed and unveiled and all of those things, that in all of that there's some sort of racing component included in it. I don't know if they will choose to attach that, Graham, to that event and also do the racing side, or if that would be something that follows a few hours later or the next day, etc. But yeah, dates and timing at least, I'm not 100% clear on the strategy here, but that should be a mystery to y'all because, I live in a rather permanent state of befuddlement.
It's an odd thing, isn't it? Because there are different ways in which organizations, or that matter individuals, decide to strategize about these things. You see some that's a new car and the race car immediately together and putting all their collateral out there. Others will launch the road car, and then days, weeks, months later, we'll launch the race program. It could be Petit Le Mans. It could be months later. There's no reason for that race car to be out in the public domain other than, clearly they're looking to, not that they've done a particularly great job of it, other than they're looking to reduce the impact of spy shots of their future race program. It's an interesting one. It's good to have the date confirmed, good to have actually the reality that it's definitely going to be confirmed, because let's face it, we should not in this day and age assume that something we have seen as a prototype and a spy picture of a car is necessarily nowadays going to make it to the marketplace. So it is therefore very good news to lovers of good GT racing that Corvette has confirmed that we definitely will get the C8. Let's wait to see what happens with the C8R. I've zero doubt it's coming, but it's an interesting proposition as to whether or not it comes on the same day or somewhat later.
One thing that stands out to me as well, Graham, just a curiosity. We'll obviously learn as to what they've chosen to do here before long, but if you read reactions to what folks have seen with the spy shots of the C8, even the C8R race car on track, and also just the general thoughts of, a mid-engine Corvette, this is going so much against the grain. Part of me wonders if they decide to integrate the race car into the launch to really bolster the looks and appeal and just this overall brand shift of what the new Corvette will happen to be. I would just say that there are a lot of Corvette loyalists. Well, is there anything but a Corvette loyalist? I've just seen and read a lot of things from folks saying, "Oh, yeah, that doesn't look what I had thought it might look like. It's not super pleasing." And or name a mid-engine car that looks similar. Oh, the front looks a little bit like, an Audi or a Lam. Pick the front looks like this part, the back looks like that part. It doesn't necessarily stand out as, something totally brand new and original. More questions or comments that I've seen saying, I don't know. So again, they are obviously not oblivious to those comments. So part of me wonders, Graham, if they'll say, well, what's one way to maybe push this over the top in terms of first impressions and salesmanship when we confirm it all? Maybe it's having the race car right there to show that, no, this is racy and this is aggressive and cool and et cetera, just to try and push that narrative even harder from the outset. So little curiosity there. I know we wanted to jump into the next category. Let me just grab two more that stand out very quickly in IMSA. Sure. One comes in from our pal Rob Chalmers, who says, second time I'm throwing this in, he says, what was that? Quote, Mazda must deliver by date X you gave us again? I'm just worried we're close and they can't seem to buy luck. Yeah, Rob, I don't know. I should probably write these things down so I remember them. I think if it wasn't Long Beach, I think it was probably Mid-Ohio, maybe Detroit at the latest, but it was roughly the first half of the season, if not earlier. And yeah, I mean, last weekend sure seemed like a prime opportunity for Mazda to get that first win. More problems and calamity with the one entry where we had Jonathan Bomarito crashing the number 55, riding off the chassis. The team ended up working effectively an all-nighter to replace that tub Graham. Then had more problems in the race. Yeah, just really tough there. The 77 entry certainly looked very competitive. Tristan Nunez was just on the boil from the outset, so that was great to see when the green flag waved. I thought they should have had the pace to challenge the Acura's challenge the number 31 Action Express entry, which got into the lead and did some pretty impressive stuff. Just didn't seem to be there. Seemed like they might have lost out a little bit on one of the pit stops too. Yeah, I heard, and I still have to confirm all of this, I'd heard that Larry Holt was not only on the timing stand, but engineering.
Wow.
I believe the 55 entry. Yeah, I believe the 55 car as well. Yeah, don't hold me to that 100%. I was told that by a couple of people very much in the know, and although I saw Larry Thursday night, actually shared a table with him at the RDC dinner, did not get a chance to see him and ask him directly, but yeah, I don't know, man. I just would love for whatever thing that needs to settle. I'd love to see, and I think IMSA fans would like to see Mazda not only get a win, that long overdue first win, but also maybe at Mid-Ohio to just have safe and simple round. Both cars roll out for the first practice. Both cars go into the trailer Sunday night with no crashes, no damages, no misfortune, no strategy mistakes, no driver mistakes. Maybe a podium for one of them, maybe a win. It'd be awesome to see going into the fourth race of the year for IMSA to just roll out, roll home, and nothing other than their performances on track and hopefully a somewhat positive outcome in the race. There's nothing else to talk about because, to our, I think, surprise, we haven't had that yet. Even though 3 races are down already, there has not been the ability to get through a full race. One being 24 hours, one being 12, one being an hour and 40 minutes, where both cars just have drama-free runs. So, yeah, whether you're a Mazda fan or not, Rob, I just, boy, it's starting to get hard to come up with reasons as to why they aren't succeeding. And I'll just take this one from Joshua Johnson last to close, Graham, and then we'll go to WEC, AsLMS, ELMS, ACO, your specialty. Joshua says, do you think that IMSA will include a provision on how many seasons a manufacturer can run an exclusive deal with a team before making the cars available for other teams who want to run them? I think I've suggested something similar in the past, Joshua, but it's hard. It would be hard for IMSA to hold the line on this and say, okay, DPI manufacturer, automotive company, you cannot participate in our series unless up front you agree to a multi-year contract that says after pick the number of years you must make those cars available. All the brands that are currently competing in DPI thoroughly enjoy it. I don't know if any of them would let a sanctioning body dictate business terms of what they do with their money, whether they make their assets available to others. I love the idea. I hate the fact that Acura and Mazda will not sell their cars to others right now. But that is their prerogative. And, you know, if we're just thinking about the size, Graham, of an Acura/Honda versus what is a rather tiny organization by comparison in IMSA, yeah, I don't see how an Acura/Honda is dictated to by any sanctioning body in order to participate. It would be much easier for them to say, cool, thanks, we're out. You're not going to tell us what we have to do. These are things that we own. We choose to spend money. If you want to have us, we'd love to be there. But otherwise, you're not getting into our pockets or dictating how we choose to run things. So what you hope, Joshua, is like a Cadillac and like a Ligier with the Nissan that they sell. We did have with Cadillac, there was, call it exclusivity for a couple of years there. They then decided to, instead of just picking the teams they wanted to work with, opened up the books to allow teams that had the means to buy to come in and do so. That's why we have a JDC, Miller Motorsports. That's why we have a Home Coast Racing added in this year, which is awesome. I would also say that, although Core is the only team running the Ligier, the Onroc, Nissan Onroc Nissan Onroc DPI right now, yeah, that thing sure has been fast. So I'm surprised that other teams have not stepped up to buy one of those. But ultimately, you would just hope, Joshua, that manufacturers do realize that after that window you speak of, all right, we're going to come in for a couple of years with something new, figure it out on our own, do our own thing. Once we get to a place where we feel we can win, be successful, maybe even earn a championship, then we can spread the love a little bit. That's the hope. Speaking of hope, the great white hope, Graham Goodwin, it's time for me to pipe down and throw lots of questions to you, starting with, I'm not sure, where should we start? We'll go with Unagile Cash Django. Again, we need explanations.
No, I know this one.
You do?
Yes.
This fine person who is submitting questions to us? Okay. We're going to go to the abbreviated UCJ, who says, it's been asked before, but with the ELMS's fine display at Paul Ricard, does anyone really need LMP1? An LMP2 Plus with open engine choice would do just fine. DPI. The 1,000 horsepower days are over. Why this, in my humble opinion, rather anal politicking around hybrid hypercars that may not show up after all? Interesting, and this seems to be a prevailing wisdom as the days go by.
Yeah, well, first unpicking the puzzle of our good friend Unagile Cash Django, that I believe to be an anagram of Johannes Gauklika, and I think that's our good mate Johannes from the fantastic country of Austria. I think there needs to be a bit of a timeout with this. It's nonsensical where we find ourselves. I did a lot of sniffing around at Paul Ricard and beyond about what's going on, where, when, and what basically I'm getting back now from those that have answers to the questions is that they don't terribly much have answers to those questions. So we're effectively being told now, stop guessing, start waiting for manufacturers to make those determinations and those decisions. And I think whilst I appreciate that, that's actually quite worrying. I think they are genuinely unsure now of what comes next. We heard you in the room together with me when Gerard Neveu said it, that they do have a plan B. Quite exactly what that plan B might be, I think an awful lot of people are trying to guess at the moment. My view is that where I think we're heading for is at least 2 grandfathered years with the current cars. At least 2 grandfathered years with the current cars. I think we are struggling towards a position where there might be a couple of early takers, whether or not we've passed the red line for Toyota, and potentially whether or not we might get any combination of Aston Martin and Red Bull, one, other, or both, I think is an open question. Whether or not someone else is in the mix, I've seen colleague Gary Watkins' recent story in Autosport that talks about whether or not Ford might go hypercar. I can't for the life of me understand why, after all the machinations, they might do that with the Ford GT or a hypercar version of that, effectively LMP1 spec version of that basis. I don't know, is the honest answer. I think we're at a really tricky point. Could some form of open rule book, more open rule book, be part of the plan B? I sort of hope it is. I've said before on the show, I'll say it again. I think if we've got to the stage where BOP is a strong part of the solution, or rather it's the defining part of the solution, then I genuinely don't see why that shouldn't extend to other more established platforms. And yes, I believe that includes DPI, and I believe it potentially includes something like Class 1 as well. The difficulty is what happens with tyres as well, whether or not you have an open tyre formula or you don't. And I just think we've got to get to the stage where we allow the market to decide what the hell it wants, rather than this frankly nonsensical kind of squabbling between rule makers and manufacturers as to what is the solution. I think if we gave them as close as possible to a corporate run what you brung, and made it very clear that there are some pretty stringent components to that formula, which have to include that they have to commit those cars to a World Endurance Championship. Okay, there's got to be accommodation for IMSA as well, but that clearly, my view is it would be unacceptable for the World Championship to be a sacrificial lamb here, unless there is a plan B, which I don't believe there is on that front. Then I'm of the opinion right now that unless we've got names in the bank that they are absolutely certain are going to be coming, and I have serious reason to doubt that there are terribly many right now in the early parts of this formula, then it is time to consider what actually moving to balance of performance means in the real world. That means the risks, and they are legion, but it also means the opportunities. And the opportunities that moving to balance of performance offers could be something of a revelation. It provides massive challenges, but it does provide opportunities. There are other cars, manufacturer-supported cars, that are capable of meeting that level of performance, that performance window that's being defined. And does that include Gen 2 DPI? It potentially does. Does it include Class 1? It potentially does. Does it include grandfathered LMP1 cars? It most certainly does. Does it include cars road-based and prototype-based against the regulations that we know the manufacturers now have in their hands? It absolutely does. Time, I'm afraid, manufacturers, to get into the game, or tell them that you're not coming.
So I'm going to, in lieu of moving to the next question, ask you to climb upon the mighty Week in Sports Car soapbox. Something, dear listeners, we might have stood upon just before we started recording today. And ask you, Graham, piggybacking on what you just said, but maybe a little bit more sharply focused on a topic that continues to trouble the two of us to a higher degree every week, and that is our friends, and they are friends, at the ACO and WEC appear to be in a place with their future headlining prototype class, in a place where they are seemingly subject to the changing whims or interests of manufacturers who've yet to commit, want to commit, dangling the possibility of committing to hypercar. We seem to be in a place, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and some direction where you think it should follow, on whether the ACO and WEC needs to say, stop. We are taking no more phone calls, no more emails. We are publishing the exact rules as we want them to be, and you either need to accept them and join, or walk away. Or, if you think the ongoing, constant, change this, change that, what about this, move this thing for us, nature is a representation of the fact that these rules might be too far away from what any of those manufacturers want. And so maybe the ACO, instead of saying, stop it, we're jump in or jump out, but no more. Do you think they should either do that, or do you think they should maybe recognize the constant influx of, could you tweak this, could you change that? We might be in, but only if you shift this over here instead of there. is a signal to the ACO and WC that the rules, these just aren't a goer. There's nothing here that can work. Step back, pause, and say, hey, 2020's off the table. It's going to be 21-22. Clearly the feedback and the mini insurrections on a weekly basis should be received as, nope, we got this one wrong, don't press forward. Which one of those two? Because it seems like we need to pick a lane or pick a direction and do it.
Right, let's go for it. I think first and foremost, our friends and colleagues at the FI and ACO have been guilty over the last few years of being maybe a little naive in some of the negotiations. I think they've also been misled fairly substantially by some pretty big names out there. Stand Up Porsche, who most certainly took them a long way down the line of telling them they were committed for a new rule set and then walked away with very limited notice towards formulary, etc. And that's part of what we've talked about before on the show, this drive at board level and at marketing level for electrification. Stand up to Peugeot, that frankly, on both sides, was pretty disgraceful. I think everybody's got a good reason to kind of look at their own actions and think, was that really in the interest of anybody at all? Peugeot themselves, and frankly the rule makers as well, went way too far down the road with the hope and expectation on the part of those behind the rule set for the WEC and the Le Mans 24 Hours that Peugeot would stand by their stated commitments. If we do that, if this is achieved and that is achieved, we will come. And then Peugeot, of course, did not come. Beyond that, we've got one or two of the current takers in the hypercar regulation round robin that frankly have muddied the waters, but then are not ready to launch any kind of program. If you're going to sit down and change that rule book as fundamentally as it's been changed, then for God's sake do so with a program on the table. And there's at least one of those manufacturers that fundamentally doesn't have that. And I strongly suspect that I know what the game is, and I'm going to keep my powder dry until I've actually checked this one out. But I'm not a million miles away from going public with what I think is the game with one of those manufacturers. The reality here is this is too valuable an asset in the Le Mans 24 Hours in particular to risk putting it into the wilderness for a year or two. I think there are a lot of people trying really, really hard. I'm not absolutely certain they've got enough assets in the current market situation to achieve what they're looking to achieve. The market outside of motorsport across the automotive world is, frankly, I think at the moment as close to chaotic as you can possibly imagine. And the parts of those organizations that are involved in motorsport are sort of being dragged along in that tsunami of unrest and rapid change. But yes, I agree with you, MP. I think what needs to happen right now is I think there needs to be a very firm red line drawn. My understanding is if we're not there, we're really very close to that. Here are the regulations, at least in a very advanced draft form that you've asked us to do. They accommodate what you, manufacturer A, and what you, manufacturer B, C, D, E, F, have asked us to accommodate. That's what you've got. Now we're going to wait, and you are going to tell us whether or not you're going to commit or not. Frankly, if they're not going to commit, further muddying the waters is just going to make this a hot mess. At that point, you've got to have, beyond your red line, another line, and the other line is the trigger point for whatever plan B is. What might that look like? It might look like what I've described a little earlier. It might look like something that you might want to be doing with your GT cars. I'm not sure that that's anything that really anybody favours. I think it might be something that one or two people might be chucking into the mix as yet more covering fire. I'll be blunt. You wanted a soapbox. Here's my soapbox. I'm pretty sick of some of the manufacturers' bullshit on this. The reality here is, if you're going to play brinksmanship, then damn well commit a program or get out of the room. That's the reality here, because all that's happening at the moment is you're pushing back a solution further and further and further, to the point where, what do you do in that situation? What do you do if you are the ACO, the FIA? You either decide that you're going to put an immovable barrier in the way of further negotiation, which could be criticised, or you continue to try to negotiate either on an individual or a quorum basis, which is going to get criticised. And at the moment, it's just messy. It's messy administratively, it's messy technically, it's messy commercially, and it's certainly messy in technological terms. And I think we are heading to something which looks like Brexit over 24 hours, a hot mess of unsatisfactory compromise. It needs some shape. I'm not going to stand here, as a bloke working in an office down the bottom of his garden and say my solution's the right solution. But frankly, as I sit here, it looks like a better solution than some. I think we need to be far more wide-ranging. I think we need to make clear where the red lines are here. And one of those red lines is, I love the idea that the IMSA teams might be able to bring their DPIs over for the Le Mans 24 hours, but I'm not prepared to sacrifice a major global championship at that altar. And my view is that needs to be shaped, and it needs to be shaped right now. By all means, bring DPI, by all means, bring Class 1, but find some way in which you commit to a more global offering for that technology, for those efforts, for those cars, and do it soon.
I'd love it. Look at that. We got a Brexit reference in there. I mean, we're on the boil. Got about 20 minutes left in this episode, my friend, and knowing that we still have many, many, many WEC, AsLM, ACO, etc. questions.
Would you like me to just run through some of the ones I can see really very quickly?
Absolutely. Pick and choose the ones that stand up.
Let's go with Stephen Gates. Says, given Roman Rusinov has stated the arrival of AsLMS for the long term in sports cars, possibly as a hypercar future, is the credence to a rumour of a link up with Rebellion. That comes from the tweeting out by Rebellion of the teaser video from AsLMS. I sat down at a coffee with a ebullient Roman Rusinov at the ELMS test. He basically rang Rebellion's Kaleem and asked him, would you do that just for a laugh? Basically to see if people actually bite and think it's Rebellion. They did that. It got plenty of traffic. He was having a chuckle about it. So might there be some kind of marketing tie-in? Yes. Is he looking to what happens next with the AsLMS? Yes, he is. You might be surprised. You remember that story we wrote about an AsLMS DPI? I'm not saying there'll be a DPI, but watch this space. There is plenty going on at G-Drive. He's not messing about, and that is a very, very interesting story. Let's have a quick look. Anthony Ghosh asked about what I know about Stefan Darak. This is the new general manager of the ACO. Nothing is the answer. What I do know is that Frederic Lenard, who he replaces, certainly I think had a bit of a parting of the ways in terms of strategy with the board of the ACO. You would therefore imagine that Stefan Darak is rather more aligned with Pierre Fillon et al. The Quantumizer, which is a great name. Is there any suspicion of the increased grid size for Le Mans? Great news that we're going to have a record 62 cars at Le Mans, courtesy of some temporary garages at the Module Sportif, the pit-in end of the pit lane, with the addition now of high-class racing from Denmark and the second controversially excluded or reserve listed United Autosports car. Quantumizer asks, might that have been pushed by United doing a Ferrari F1, threatening to go somewhere else next season, like SRO-backed sports cars, if they didn't get second place? No. I had a long chat with a number of people involved in that. I think there has been some negotiation. I'll be blunt. I think what's driven this are two factors. One is, I think they saw the potential with what happened at Sebring, that the teams were not impressed about the fact they were going to go into tented accommodation, but actually when we got there, were very impressed by what they found. That therefore now being, something that was accepted as being a reasonably high quality solution becomes a potential solution. The second factor is very simple. It's commercial. The more cars are there, the more entry fees you get, the more money you collect in terms of the commercial side of things and in terms of the space you sell in hospitality and in the paddock. I think this comes down to a numbers game, and when you've got limited number of manufacturers, the reality is you then got to look at the numbers of private teams that you can get in there. I strongly suspect that the wider factor is the latter. They're the three I'm going to run through. What do you like to hear about next?
Whoa, well, look at that. You're serving it up for my pleasure. You know, it would not be an episode of the Weekend Sports Cars presented to you by Cooper Tires and the Justice Brothers without an entry from Andrew Baca, our pal, the Baxter, who says, while we seem not to be headed towards a unified global top-level prototype regulation, are we instead heading towards a Group C and GTP scenario? Differing regulations, but broadly similar enough on pace, there can be cross-pollination between IMSA and the World Championship. What do you think, man?
I think that's spot on, and I hope so. I hope we can get to the stage where, you know, at the death almost of this, that someone spots the opportunities that most certainly lie there. That's what lies at the end of this thing I've been banging on about for a few weeks here. It is so close in terms of the performance. We've got to start now looking at why there is such a difference in terms of the budget. And it does seem to be, I think, two things. One is the budgetary side of things does seem to have been rather overstated. And the second part of it is that I think at times the budgets that we are told are happening on the DPI side may be somewhat understated at times. So I think these things are rather closer than perhaps we're led to believe. We certainly know that the running costs of those cars across a full season in IMSA and in the WEC are not dramatically different. In terms of the WEC, it tends to be the logistical costs of a global championship. In the case of IMSA, it most certainly is driven by the fact that you've got three major endurance races beyond the regular kind of less full endurance, a 2 hours, 45 minutes format. So the realities here are that there is certainly massive profit to be drawn in sporting and technical terms of something that is very much closer. I hope that out of what feels like something rather chaotic at the moment, we can see those waters clear and the white sands beneath. And yes, I hope that's exactly where we get to. We all want, I think everybody wants a global solution. We just need to find a way to find it now.
All right, my friend, we have, looking at the very informal clock that I tend to do a bad job of monitoring, we have 8 or so minutes left. Do we continue down the WEC AsLM ACO ELMS road? Do we return to general and fun? Have we had enough fun in this episode?
No, there's never enough fun. There's plenty of really good questions, by the way, that I might well just roll over into next week because we've not got a huge amount of international racing coming this weekend. So I've been kind of making a note of what we've not answered. So be assured that some of these will kind of hang over to next week. Let's have a quick look down at the kind of the fun side of things. You want to have a first crack at it?
I'm going to let you have the first crack at it, because I have a problem with crack. Wait a minute. Disregard.
Here's one you might know the answer to. Luke Filipponi might be a dumb question, but here it goes. Why are sports car prototypes left or right-hand drive? Why not have the seating position in the middle like a single-seater?
Well,
I think it's by regulation, isn't it?
It absolutely is by regulation, and manufacturers are certainly allowed to choose which side they prefer to place their driver on. But yeah, although a central cockpit standard might be fun, but boy, I don't know if and when we would see such a thing actually implemented. But interesting nonetheless. But yeah, it's strictly how the rules happen to be written.
I mean, we've had cars in the past, notably, of course, the McLaren F1, which is in a central cockpit. The road car obviously having kind of seats either side of the central driving seat. And I think there's been one more recently, but the regulations do have to accommodate exit and entry from both sides, and that's been particularly problematic with the introduction of these kind of crash bars, these bars across the middle of the cockpit, which have to be hinged to allow the driver to get out on the non-driving side. So those bars are hinged and can move to allow rapid exit. But yet there is a difference between some of those cars being left or right-hand drive. And I'm trying to remember, and failing horribly, I'm afraid, a driver talking about exactly that at the weekend, and adapting to their previous drive. And I've got a feeling that might have been an LMP3 car, but I'll double check my notes on that, maybe bring that back, moving to a car where they were used to being on the left-hand side and now on the right-hand side of the car.
I say on top of the roof. Now that would be fun. Hashtag me personally, that's my vote. My vote for pure and sheer stupidity. Here's one. I don't know if it's fun, but it's interesting. I'll throw to you from Tom Welfie. It says, hi there, gentlemen. Do you feel that the sports car world would be much different had Lola not gone out of business? I seem to remember there being a number of ALMS teams with the intent of running Lola P2s, but due to Lola's financial situation, the cars didn't come to fruition. Lola, and maybe on a greater scope, Graham. I mean, they were what Dallara is to international open wheel racing. They got something for everybody. Lola was more or less that option for prototypes, really prior to the advent of LMP3. Where do you think we would be if they were still around today?
I think it might be more accessible. Oddly, this knits neatly in with something we had. We didn't quite get to, but I'll roll it in now from Adam Bowman, who was asking a quick general question. What happened to some of the more bespoke LMP2 cars of the last generation, the BR01, the Dome S103? Lola fell victim to commercial pressures, simple as that. And it came down to the late and lamented Martin Biriani, as he was popularly known in certainly the UK end of the press room, and deciding for family reasons that he did not want to continue to put his own private funding in to keep that operation afloat. Bits of that operation still are afloat, and parts of its IP now sits, of course, with Multimatic, which is effectively its successor. But the reality was that it was not commercially sustainable. In a different world, at a different time, then it might have meant that with their business model, had their business model been more successful, that LMP2 racing might have been more accessible, might have been more affordable. Adam, the reasoning behind the BR01, the Dome, biting the bullet was those 2017 regulations, which you will recall named 4 licensed chassis suppliers. And there's other questions, by the way, that ask who we think might be on the list next time around. I've got an inkling of at least one that might fall, and I've got an inkling of one that might actually come in, but I think those questions are going to be answered. Well, I think a lot is going to be determined not by what happens in the global LMP2 market, but by what IMSA decide about DPI, because there is a galloping reality here that whilst absolutely the economies that come with the global P2 area things, is that is what is making, for instance, the Dallara program sustainable. We have one car left now in the ELMS, and at the moment we have one that is committed right now for next year's WEC, and that ain't going to cut it. And I'm not sniffing very much intent from Dallara in doing much to promote that product. I think they know they've actually got a car that is not ultimately competitive. I think that we are going to see some changes there. I think it's going to be very interesting where they go with that debate, whether or not we stay with 4, whether it's 5, whether it's 3, and what happens with the IMSA DPI regulations. I cannot see them not accommodating the potential for having whatever LMP2 becomes moving forward, because that has been a massive plus in helping those DPI figures to add up, to keep those budgets down to where you've got the success that DPI has been. But it is an interesting one. As for Lola, I mourn its loss. I genuinely do. You think about some of the little teams that actually made their way into and through racing, through those products. It's, we've got a lot to thank the Lola guys, and particularly Martin Bahrain taking it over from Eric Broadley at a time when Lola was struggling massively, and we had some good times with it. But yes, I mourn its loss. We're in a different world now, and I wait with bated breath, probably more important in terms of the depth of the racing that we love, as to the decisions that are made about LMP2 than right now the decisions we've been talking about for most of the show about LMP1.
I would say that, knowing how we're looking at potential manufacturers and some that we've thrown out, any thoughts on the rumors that following the return of Brabham with the BT62, can you weigh in on the other rumor we've heard that there might be a new constructor, that being Christoph Bouchou with the Bouchou BTFU?
Well, I don't know if you spotted the tweet midweek, but having been prompted to have a look, it was actually to do with the fact that Racing Engineering last year, an ELMS team, announced their program for 2019, and they are moving to the NASCAR Wheel and Euro Series, so stock car racing in Europe for Racing Engineering. That prompted me to look at who the driver names were in that series of 2019, and who did I find but Christopher Bucket, who will be part of the NASCAR Wheel and Euro Series in 2019. So I suspect he's been employed by the people that actually sell the spares, because my guess is that's going to be hot racing there from Christoph. But the Bouchou P2 car could be quite interesting, couldn't it?
Just think about that in this new wheel and NASCAR thing of his. It's an entirely new series to create hatred and division, right? I mean, it's like terraforming a new planet in so many ways. Graham, we'll grab two more and then bid farewell to this episode. We'll go to our pal Jacob Beam, who says, second attempt here. Recently I've had a discussion about Class 1 and its values, and whether or not it's the best and most promising of current sports car classes out there. I argued that it is, at best, aspiring to that crown, as there are no series utilizing Class 1 in the Americas, making it not a universal global formula. So the question is, are there any prospects of seeing Class 1 cars in the Americas in the near future? And if yes, which series would be most likely? Could Trans Am, for example, viably adopt that rule set as a next step on the way to retaining its former glory? You might have the first part. The second part, I can tell you, Trans Am, there's no way in hell that's ever happened. No. Ever.
I've just fallen out of time with a fair amount of information I picked up at Sebring and beyond about Class 1. I think the answer here is, I think it's a better prospect that it's going to be given the opportunity to show, I think, is the main point here. Yes, BMW came forward with it, and they had good reason to, because, of course, they've already got investment in the IP. I don't expect it to be the option, the direction that IMSA take for DPI Gen 2. I don't expect that to be the case, but I think it could do with another look. I think it's got real potential. There's some really interesting comments made by Scott Atherton at Sebring, both on the record and privately to myself, about what lessons they can learn from the process that's the ITR that look after DTM and the Class 1 regulations had taken. That will be the subject, I hope, of a piece for Daily Sports Car in the coming weeks. I think when you look at things like common componentry, which certainly form a big part of the Class 1 regulations, that is quite an interesting way to go. You clearly want to have as good a blend as you can of things that reduce cost, but things that actually allow innovation and competition. You, MP, have been absolutely on the money for months and months and months on this one. Less spec, more opportunity for people to show why they're special. But in the modern world we now live in, I suspect the pressures drive us even further down the spec racer side of things. It doesn't mean to say the racing's any worse. We had some fantastic racing over the weekend, for instance, LMP3 at Paul Ricard. But this is where we're talking about the absolutely top tier level. And Class 1, I think, produces great racing. Sprint racing in Germany, endurance racing in Japan. Has it got other prospects? Yes, it does. Will we see them come to fruition? I'm not sure we will.
Well, speaking of will, I have a will to pose one more item. And that's going to come in from our pal Thomas, who says, I figured out easier and shorter names for all those hashtag Blancpain GT series. First of all, the IGTC will be named the Rattel World Series. I love it. We have what I guess is replacing the Blancpain World GT Americas will be called American Rattel Series. And Thomas says in brackets the acronym ARS, A-R-S, lowercase e. May or may not be a coincidence. We then have the Rattel Endurance Series, the Rattel Sprint Series, and the Asian Rattel Series. I think he's onto something, Graham. I really do, because it's all working some form of 3-letter acronym instead of 27-letter acronym. ARS is kind of in there for at least 2 of them, both the American Rattel Series and Asian Rattel Series. We've got Endurance and Sprint covered off, and we have World. How is Thomas not employed as a branding and marketing director by our pal Stefan?
It's amazing, isn't it, that he's missed out on the opportunity from you, Thomas. Look, first things first, one of the things I've always found quite interesting is why is Stefan Rattel known almost universally by his surname? It is an odd thing, isn't it? It's very often referred to. He even refers to himself nowadays when he talks about people talking about him as Rattel. Number one, I think if you have the opportunity to sit down with Stefan Rattel, you would be surprised. Number two is, I'll say again what I've said a million times before, we simply wouldn't be standing having this conversation on opposite sides of the Atlantic were it not for Stefan Rattel. Okay, he's not Beelzebub, he's not the devil. There are things about the form of racing that he now promotes across the world.
What about Rattelzebub? Rattelzebub seems like a really awesome cartoon and t-shirt.
However, the one area where if I had the opportunity, and I recently took the opportunity to feed into the SRO thought process, yes, I think the naming of championships has got a little out of control. I'll tell you how out of control it got. It got out of control to the degree where there was an exchange between myself and his senior PR person about the fact that one or two of the things we had on the Daily Sports Car website were not up to date. I fed back, there is a reality here that when you put something in that is the Blancpain World, the Blancpain World Challenge America, it's just too long. GT World Challenge America. I knew I was missing something. And actually, when I looked at my website while we were having that conversation, I realized that 2 of the championships that we'd actually got there correctly had resulted by us putting the correct name into our website, that it had effectively broken it because they were too long, and it meant that something that should have been sitting in a nice, neat box now sat in the middle of the story below it when you had the kind of drop down. The reality here is it's not just the ACO. It is when we get to other events. I habitually, by the way, will simply not write in a story when we've got naming sponsors, presenting sponsors, etc., etc., etc. And there's 3 reasons for that. One is, guys, I haven't got the time, nor the energy, nor the inclination. 2 is, those people are not paying me money. It is the 12 hours of Sebring. It will always be the 12 hours of Sebring. And 3 is, they look ridiculous. I'm terribly sorry, but the names that we are asked to describe some of these names as, I'm delighted that it puts dollars into pockets and brings activation to the race meetings, but I'm terribly sorry. I, as the editor of Daily Sports Car, nor the readers of Daily Sports Car, we're not interested in having the first 2 lines of our story occupied by the name of the race. It's ridiculous. And, I get it. I am supportive of the drive to actually drive that commercial activity, but I'm afraid I'm not going to be supporting that in general, beyond maybe one mention, throughout the thousands of words of copy that we produce about those race meetings. We'll find other ways to recognise the efforts of those sponsors. I get it. I mean, I think the reality is they've just got to find a better way of doing this, because if they don't find a better way of doing this, we're either going to use an acronym, in which case the sponsors can be lost anyway, or we're going to find a way of shortening the titles of those series. I, like you, Marshall, have genuinely, no, all joking aside,
you too, Graham.
Yes, I know. Genuinely been confused as to what the hell they're actually called. It's not just the GT World Challenge stuff, which actually does have some common sense behind it when you think about that. But when we've got to the stage now where what used to be called the Blancpain GT Endurance Cup series or whatever, and the Blancpain GT Sprint series, which had a common identity, now have 2 completely separate identities, with the Blancpain Endurance Cup or series, whatever it's called, and now GT World Challenge Europe. Then we've got to the stage where I'm kind of thinking, someone lost the plot here? Or have we got to the stage where you're layering one plan on top of another one? I sort of think they need to be locked in a room for a week or so and come out with a better answer here. It certainly seems that decisions have been made on the back of other decisions, We've got a hell of a lot of series. And if I, as the editor of Daily Sports Car, that cover this for a living, have been confused by that, what chance have the fans got?
I love the fact that we got you on 2 soapboxes presented by Mobile One. The Mobile One 12 minutes of soapbox. There we go. I love it. I mean, and here's the other thing too. Part of me is convinced, Graham, that someone, probably not Stefan, but someone at the SRO said, let's see how many words we can get these idiots to type in every report. And, I think there's just a little bit of a social experiment, and also having fun at our expense of, possibly, maybe they could get a naming right sponsor for the name of the series. So wouldn't that be amazing? So truly, they found a sponsor for just the name of the series itself. So not only do we have Blancpain, but we have Blancpain presented by, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, maybe that would just be all kinds of fun here. So, anyways.
It's all part of the fun and games. I mean, we can all laugh at, the the ALMS's presenting cheese, Yancey's Fancy, a real thing, by the way. We can all have a laugh at that, and I'll happily kind of pop that into a kind of notebook. But there is a reality here, is there is a massive difference between what is going to be activation at a race meeting and what actually is a legitimate part of the reporting of that event. And I think actually sometimes the series management, and it's just about every series is guilty of this, need to just get a little bit real about this and understand that sometimes shortening that for effect is a real thing.
All right. Well, for the effect of shortening this episode, we're going to say farewell. We're also going to say, as we try to do each week, if we did not get to your question and you would like it answered for sure, please send it through again. Sometimes it takes a third. Once or twice it's taken a fourth. But yes, we certainly appreciate your taking the time to send in questions in this 90-minute format. Sometimes we struggle to get to all of them. So if you want it answered, send it in again, and we will indeed get to it. I am Marshall Pruitt. That is the delightful soapbox-prone Graham Goodwin, and I love it when you're on the boil, mate. We need to say thank you once more to our awesome, awesome friends and partners at the Justice Brothers, who gave me a delightful coat last weekend at Long Beach, by the way. And also to our awesome friends at Cooper Tires, who are working on something really cool for us as well, knowing that we are a little over 2 weeks away from celebrating the 3rd anniversary of our little Marshall Pruitt podcast here. Wow. So thanks to both of them. Thanks to you, the entire dailysportscar.com crew. We're going to have to spank Ryan Kish, though, because he didn't serve up the questions as he was supposed to. So it might be 50 push-ups or some other kind of penalty. But other than that, Graham, thank you for taking your time this week. Thank you, dear listeners, for being who you are and sending in these great questions that we truly, truly enjoy. And other than that, we will speak to you early next week here on the Week in Sports Cars.